Before marble thrones and golden handles, before porcelain bowls and perfumed soaps, there was dirt, dust, and determination. The story of ancient toilets is not one of filth, it is one of progress. It is the silent tale of what civilizations chose to hide and what they dared to clean. It is the story of human dignity built on stone seats and clay pipes. And it all begins in the murky waters of the Fertile Crescent. Somewhere around 4000 BCE, when cities were still dreams rising from the reeds, a people called the Sumerians were doing something extraordinary. They were learning to wash, to bathe, to relieve themselves away from where they cooked. And in doing so, they laid the first bricks of a sanitary revolution. In the Sumerian city of Uruk, among temples of sun-baked mud and homes etched with reed patterns, archaeologists unearthed something peculiar, a series of pits lined with brick, sloped gently downward and connected to what could only be described as rudimentary drains. At first, scholars scoffed. Surely these were for grain storage, or sacrificial rituals, or animal waste. But the evidence was too human, traces of waste. Water channels designed to rinse, the unmistakable design of a seated squatting pit. These were toilets. In the heart of the desert, long before modern plumbing, people had designed a way to separate themselves from their own waste. And they had done it not out of luxury, but necessity. Disease, insects, rot, the enemies of early cities were invisible and constant. The solution? Flowing water. Nearby, the Sumerians built bathing rooms, entire chambers with sloped floors and stone drains. It wasn't just a practical innovation, it was spiritual. Cleanliness, to them, was divine. Ritual washing before prayer, before meals, before touching sacred texts, it became part of daily life. In these ancient lavatories, soap made from ash and animal fat was rubbed over skin worn by sun and wind. Yet their greatest invention may have been the clay pipe. Buried beneath the surface of Uruk and Lagash, archaeologists found channels no wider than a forearm tubes of fired clay fitted tightly together, gently angled to let waste and water run out of the city. Gravity was their silent ally. It was a marvel of engineering. Rome would later become famous for aqueducts, but the Sumerians had already laid the groundwork literally and figuratively. But what of privacy? Here, things become murkier. Early toilets were often communal. Privacy was not sacred, it was a modern notion. Ancient people defecated in rows, sometimes beside one another. Some historians even believe discussions were held mid-relief, that decisions were made in the warm silence of the bathhouses. The act, stripped of shame, was simply another facet of life. And yet, shame would soon be built stone by stone. Travel east to the Indus Valley, to the city of Mohenjo-Daro. Here, the toilet reaches architectural perfection. Nearly every house had one. Not the public pits of Mesopotamia, but private, enclosed cubicles, connected to vertical chutes and covered drains. Some were built above cesspits that were regularly cleaned, possibly by servants or a designated caste. Others led to drains that exited the city itself. It was a civilization obsessed with order. Grids of streets, standardized bricks, and sanitation so efficient that no rival city matched it for another 1,000 years. These toilets were not simple holes, they were raised platforms designed for seated relief. Water, stored in small jars or drawn from wells, was used for washing. There is evidence of sieve-like devices, possibly used for straining solid waste. Soapstone trays for foot washing, and in the grandest houses, even dual chamber systems, one for bathing, another for waste. The Indus Valley was not only ahead of its time, it was ahead of ours. Yet just as quickly as it rose, it fell. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities of the Indus disappeared. Whether by drought, invasion, or shifting rivers, no one knows. But with their fall, one of the greatest achievements in hygiene was lost to history. And while the Indus Valley faded into dust, another empire was rising in the Nile. In ancient Egypt, the concept of cleanliness took on a new form. Here, the desert met the divine. The Nile, sacred and sustaining, became the source of all washing. Pharaohs were bathed in milk and honey. Priests shaved their bodies to avoid lice. And toilets? They existed, but they served more than just function. In wealthy homes, stone or wooden seats were built over sand-filled pots. After use, a servant would remove the sand and replace it. It was a system not unlike the cat litter of today, pragmatic, portable, and eerily modern. In temples, priests cleansed themselves before each ceremony using basins filled with holy water. Cleanliness was not only hygienic, it was spiritual armor against impurity. The lower classes, however, relied on communal pits or simple fields. Some carried small containers with them, primitive chamber pots, to avoid public shame. But even among the poor, washing was sacred. The sun god Ra demanded purity. Dirt was an affront to the gods. So much so that Egyptian medicine became obsessed with the bowels. Entire papyri were written about enemas, how to administer them, with what tools, and using which oils or herbs. The god of healing, Thoth, was said to have invented the enema syringe. Hospitals staffed by priests administered them regularly. It was believed that disease began in the gut, and the answer then was to flush it out. And so, across deserts and rivers and homes and temples, a quiet war was waged. A war not against enemies, but against rot, against smell, against death by disease. And at the center of it all was the toilet, humble, hidden, and vital. But if the Egyptians and Sumerians had made the toilet functional, another people would make it a statement, a symbol of wealth, a cornerstone of civic pride. In the rugged hills of the Mediterranean, the Greeks were about to bring toilets into the public square. In the marble cities of ancient Greece, where philosophers walked barefoot through the agora and Olympians raced beneath open skies, there existed a truth few history books capture, a truth that lies not in temples or epics, but in latrines. To understand the Greeks, one must understand their obsession with the ideal body, the ideal city, the ideal citizen. And yet, even in this world of abstract thought and celestial geometry, the very human act of relieving oneself was not hidden in shame, it was shared in stone. The Greeks did not invent the toilet, but they refined it. They gave it structure, context, and perhaps for the first time in history, dignity through architecture. It began in the heart of the polis, the city-state. As cities like Athens, Corinth, and Delos grew, so too did their understanding of waste. Human waste, they learned, was not just a personal issue, it was a civic concern. The answer? Public toilets? These were no mere pits or makeshift seats. Greek public toilets were wide, open chambers built of stone, often situated near marketplaces, bathhouses, or gymnasiums. Along the walls ran rows of smooth stone benches, perforated with evenly spaced holes. Beneath the benches, a continuous water channel flowed, a simple but effective means of flushing. A second trench, sometimes filled with clean water, allowed users to rinse with a sponge on a stick. Yes, the infamous xylospongum, a tool as curious as it was practical. Shared among patrons and rinsed in communal basins, it served as ancient toilet paper. The Greeks didn't find it strange, they found it effective. But more than function, these toilets served a social role. They were places of discussion, of gossip, even of debate. Just as the symposiums gathered men to drink and philosophize, so too did the toilets gather them in moments of collective humanity. Here, stripped of pretense and clothing, they sat in a line, not unlike their gods on Olympus, equal in their needs, if only for a moment. Yet this communal aspect did not extend to everyone. Women, especially those of citizen status, had fewer options. Most used chamber pots in private quarters, often emptied into nearby streets or cesspits. Privacy, paradoxically, was reserved for the disempowered. Slaves, meanwhile, were the invisible gears of sanitation. They cleaned the pots, emptied the trenches, maintained the water channels. Their labor ensured the system flowed quietly, anonymously. And though we think of Greece as sunlit and whitewashed, its cities could stink. Sanitation, even with drains, was a constant struggle. Waste was often dumped into alleys or carried outside the walls. Rain helped. So did dogs and pigs, allowed to roam freely and consume scraps. But the burden of filth was always present, especially in dense cities like Athens. This tension between ideal and reality defined Greek hygiene. Bathing, for instance, was ritualized. Gymnasiums included baths, both hot and cold, where men washed after exercise. Soap was still rudimentary, usually made from oil and ash, but the emphasis was on scraping. Strigils, Bronze or iron tools shaped like curved blades were used to scrape sweat and dirt from the skin. It was an act both cleansing and aesthetic. Oil was applied beforehand, often olive oil, infused with herbs, and after exercise, scraped away with the strigil. The oil, mixed with dirt and sweat, was considered valuable. Athletes sometimes sold the residue to apothecaries, who believed it held medicinal properties. A strange but revealing testament to Greek thought. Even filth had virtue, if properly understood. Temples had ablution fountains. Priests were required to purify themselves before rituals, and sacred precincts were protected by laws forbidding urination or defecation within their bounds. The gods, after all, demanded cleanliness, if not of the soul, then at least of the sandals. Homes, however, were simpler. Most lacked running water. Waste was stored in chamber pots and emptied in the morning. The wealthy might have indoor latrines, small rooms with a seat above a pot or pit. In some elite households, clay pipes carried waste into nearby drains, but this was rare. Even in Athens, the grandeur of civic toilets far outweighed private ones. And yet, the Greeks were thinkers. They studied the body. They observed disease. The physician Hippocrates wrote of hygiene, of the importance of clean air, fresh water, and balanced diets. He noted the danger of standing water, of spoiled food, of excrement left to fester. He did not yet understand bacteria, but he understood cause and effect. Cleanliness meant health. Health meant order. Order was divine. In the city of Pergamon, one of the jewels of the Hellenistic world, the streets sloped with purpose. Engineers designed drains beneath the paving stones. Water flowed constantly, carrying waste away from homes, bathhouses, and yes, toilets. Here, sanitation was science. Urban planning met bodily need. The toilet became infrastructure. Still, for all their intellect, the Greeks left one thing to fate: the sponge. The shared sponge, dipped again and again, passed from hand to hand, was a silent vector. Parasites, bacteria, infections, historians today shudder at the thought. Yet the ancients accepted it, trusting in flowing water and divine favor to cleanse what the eye could not see. Over time, Roman power would rise from the ashes of the Hellenic world. And with it came a mania for infrastructure, a love of order, stone, and symmetry that would change the toilet forever. But before Rome, before aqueducts and sewers, there was Greece, a place where even the most basic act could be elevated by thought, by form, and by shared experience. The toilet in Greek society was not hidden. It was simply a need met with reason. A function shared with others. A moment of vulnerability made public, made ordinary, and made perhaps a little noble. The Greeks gave us democracy, philosophy, and theater. But they also gave us this: the idea that the human body, in all its needs, deserved attention, not shame, not silence. Next, we follow this idea across the sea, to a people who built roads from stone and baths like cathedrals, who turned sanitation into an empire's foundation. Rome is calling. By the time the Roman Empire spread its banners across 3 continents, it had not only conquered armies and nations, it had subdued filth itself. In Rome, toilets were no longer just necessities, they were monuments. And like all Roman achievements, they bore the unmistakable weight of ambition. Rome did not invent the toilet. But Rome perfected it, systematized it, elevated it, and carved it in marble. The empire's genius lay in its infrastructure: roads, aqueducts, baths, and yes, cloaca. At the heart of Roman sanitation was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain. Originally a small channel built by the Etruscans, it grew under Roman engineering into a vast underground sewer, wide enough to walk through, deep enough to swallow a city's waste. Stretching beneath the streets of Rome, the Cloaca Maxima carried the refuse of thousands, funneling it into the Tiber River. But the marvel was not the sewer itself, it was how the entire city fed into it. Rome's streets sloped gently inward, allowing rain and runoff to enter covered drains. Houses and bathhouses were connected by a lattice of terracotta pipes and lead conduits. Public toilets, dozens of them, were linked to water channels that flowed day and night, flushing away filth with the slow persistence of a mountain stream. The Romans built toilets everywhere: forum side, bathhouse adjacent, near temples, and in military camps. some seated 4, others seated 40. Rows of stone or marble benches, evenly spaced, perforated with oval holes. Beneath them, flowing water carried waste away. A second channel, sometimes in front of the benches, provided clean water for rinsing, washing, or operating the infamous xylospongium, the sponge stick. Yes, the Romans adopted the Greek sponge and gave it Roman discipline. In wealthier facilities, bronze faucets dispensed water for cleaning. Wooden stalls or curtains sometimes offered privacy, but more often patrons sat shoulder to shoulder, talking politics, trade, or gossip as they relieved themselves. The toilet was not hidden. It was communal, casual, even public. To defecate alone was strange. To do so with others? Romang, the walls of these latrines were sometimes painted with fresco scenes of gods and myths or even humorous warnings. In Pompeii, a toilet fresco depicts Fortuna, goddess of fate, reminding users that not all things are within their control, especially after a heavy meal. And speaking of meals, for the Romans, digestion was more than biology, it was medicine. Physicians like Galen wrote extensively about the bowels. Regular evacuation was a sign of balance. Sluggish intestines meant an imbalance of humors. Enemas were common. So, too, were laxatives, mixtures of figs, wine, and herbs. In elite Roman homes, toilets were often placed near kitchens. Strange to modern minds, but practical to Roman ones, both functions required water. And both were, in essence, acts of transformation, turning food into waste and waste into something discarded. But what about the poor? They too had access to public toilets, free, open, and surprisingly well maintained. Rome's emperors understood that sanitation was political. Keep the people clean and disease stayed low. Keep the streets clear and trade flowed. It was not kindness. It was pragmatism. And so, in cities from Londinium to Antioch, latrines were built with care. Soldiers, too, in forts across the empire, enjoyed sanitation that rivaled today's standards. Even in the chilly frontiers of Germania, legionary camps included stone latrines with running water, sponge sticks, and ventilation shafts. But there were dangers. Despite the flowing water, Roman toilets could be perilous. Methane gas, produced by decomposing waste, sometimes ignited from nearby oil lamps. Rats and snakes, drawn by warmth and refuse, lurked in the shadows. Some Romans whispered that demons lived in toilets, that evil spirits, born from decay, could possess the careless. To counter this, protective amulets were worn, spells were recited. Tiny carvings of the god Clocina, a minor deity of the sewer, were placed near toilet entrances. Hygiene, it seemed, was not just physical, it was spiritual. Toilet paper, as we know it, did not exist. Instead, moss, wool, sea sponges, even fragments of broken pottery known as ostraca. These shards, often etched with names or messages, were sometimes used as toilet wipes, especially in satire or revenge. To clean oneself on the name of an enemy? How Romang bathhouses played a central role in this hygienic empire. Vast complexes like the Baths of Caracalla or Diocletian housed thousands daily. Hot, warm, and cold rooms, caldarium, tepidarium, frigidarium provided not just bathing, but socializing, massages, even libraries. But before one entered, defecation was encouraged. Toilets stood at the thresholds, the logic simple: cleanse the inside, then the outside. The experience was full-bodied. Aromatic oils were rubbed into the skin. Strigils scraped it off. Slaves assisted the wealthy. Musicians played nearby. Toilets and baths became centers of Roman daily life where senators and slaves, merchants and soldiers, all shared in the rituals of cleanliness. Yet despite all this innovation, all this ambition, Rome could not escape its own waste. The Tiber, though revered, became a cesspool. The sewers, while impressive, were overburdened. Disease still spread. The sponge stick, though clever, was a microbial time bomb. And as the empire weakened, its economy crumbling, its cities shrinking, so too did its sanitation systems. By the 5th century, aqueducts fell silent, pipes cracked. Public toilets were abandoned. The great cloaca maxima choked on debris. And the marble seats, once symbols of order, were left to ruin. With the fall of Rome came the fall of urban hygiene. 1,000 years of darkness followed not only in politics and learning, but in plumbing. The knowledge of sewers, drains, and toilets was forgotten, buried beneath rubble and fear. But in distant lands, new empires were rising. The Islamic caliphates, the Chinese dynasties, the kingdoms of Africa and the Indus, each with their own solutions to the eternal question, how shall we clean ourselves? Rome had answered with stone, water, and will. But the next chapter would bring new materials, new beliefs, and new dangers. For the toilet was not yet done evolving. After the aqueducts ran dry and Rome's marble latrines crumbled into ruin, Europe stumbled into a time of shadows. But far to the east and south, beyond the Mediterranean winds, something else was rising. A new civilization rooted in learning, shaped by trade, guided by scripture, began to rebuild what others had forgotten. It was a world of minarets and scrolls, gardens and geometry. And at the heart of it all stood water. Not just for thirst, but for the soul. For in the Islamic world, cleanliness was sacred. From the very birth of Islam in the 7th century, personal hygiene was not just encouraged, it was commanded. The Quran in gentle verse spoke of ablution, of washing the hands, the face, the feet before prayer, of purifying after relieving oneself. It was not a private ritual, it was a way of life. And so, wherever Islam spread, from the dusty alleys of Damascus to the fragrant courtyards of Cordoba, from the bustling ports of Cairo to the cool stone mosques of Samarkand, latrines followed, thoughtfully designed, carefully placed, built with purpose. Unlike Roman extravagance, these toilets were humble. Small, often single-user, enclosed for modesty. Privacy was important now. The Islamic latrine was discreet, positioned away from kitchens and water sources. Waste was kept separate from life, from prayer, from purity. The latrine itself was simple, a squat hole in the floor, sometimes made of glazed ceramic or carved stone, with footrests on either side. Water was essential, no dry wiping. Instead, users cleansed themselves with water poured from a small jug or vessel called a loda in South Asia, or ibrik in the Middle East. In wealthier homes, more advanced versions appeared latrines with sloped drainage, even early forms of septic systems. Clay or terracotta pipes led waste into cesspits lined with lime to reduce odor and decay. These pits were emptied periodically by sanitation workers, an unsung profession, vital to the city's health. But it wasn't just about engineering, it was about ethics. There were rules. Rules about not facing Mecca while relieving oneself. Rules about washing the hands afterward, about avoiding impurity on one's clothing. Books were written, entire treatises on the etiquette of defecation. Scholars debated the proper distance from water sources, the ideal building materials, the necessity of airflow. This was not excess. This was devotion. Public latrines appeared in caravanserais, madrasas, and city markets, quiet, functional, and always accompanied by water. Mosques had fountains and sabils, free-flowing spouts for washing. Even travelers in the desert were taught how to cleanse with sand when water was scarce, a practice called tayammum, born of mercy and practicality. Cities like Baghdad, during its peak in the Abbasid era, were models of urban planning. Streets were designed with drainage channels. Homes had private latrines. The Bimaristans hospitals of the Islamic world offered not just care, but cleanliness. Patients bathed, sheets were changed, and waste was disposed of systematically. In Cordoba, under the Umayyads of Spain, hygiene reached dazzling heights. The city had over 300 public baths, each with latrines, flowing water, and attendants. The streets were swept, the sewers maintained. At a time when Christian Europe was struggling to manage chamber pots, Cordoba sparkled like a pearl. But this cleanliness was not merely technical, it was deeply cultural. Bathing, called ghusl, was mandatory after certain acts. Washing before prayer wudu was done 5 times a day. The Prophet Muhammad himself was said to have been meticulous in hygiene. He used a miswak, a natural toothbrush made from the salvadora tree. He trimmed his nails, cleaned his nose and mouth, encouraged regular bathing, and so the faithful followed. Hygiene became a sign of spiritual discipline, a mark of inner purity. Children were taught from an early age the proper way to squat, the the words to say before entering a toilet, the prayers to whisper upon exiting. Every detail blessed, measured, meaningful. Yet even in this golden age, challenges remained. Cesspits could overflow. In dry climates, odors lingered. Disease still haunted the edges of cities. But the overall system, water-based, thoughtful, religiously anchored, was among the most advanced in the world. In the East, in cities like Nishapur, Bukhara, and Delhi, similar practices evolved. Hindu and Buddhist traditions, too, placed a strong emphasis on cleansing, ritual baths in rivers, daily ablutions. The construction of stepwells, deep, intricately carved water sources used not only for drinking, but for washing before entering temples. In South Asia, the practice of washing with water after defecation was so universal that latrines were designed with small water ducts, primitive but effective. In China, too, the Tang and Song dynasties built advanced sewer systems, especially in the south. In Japan, the Heian period saw the use of wooden scrapers and water ladles, emphasizing cleanliness as a form of aesthetic refinement. And yet, for all these advancements, Europe lagged behind. There, the fall of Rome had plunged toilets into obscurity. Chamber pots were tossed from windows. Streets were slick with waste. Disease festered in silence. But in the Islamic world, a different legacy was being written. One of hygiene not as luxury, but duty. Of toilets not as embarrassment, but as instruments of purity. This legacy would quietly pass into the Renaissance, into the writings of returning crusaders, into the public baths of Sicily and Andalusia, into the silent architectures of forgotten latrines hidden behind mosque walls and beneath caravanserai floors. Here, the toilet was not glorified, but it was honored. Not a throne, but a vessel, not a marvel, but a mercy. And as the stars of the Islamic world began to dim and new empires stirred in the West, another revolution was beginning, this time in Northern Europe, a colder world, a dirtier world, a world about to rediscover the value of what it had once abandoned. The Middle Ages had begun, and with them, a descent into waste. The lights of Rome had gone out. The aqueducts had fallen silent. The marble latrines of the empire were now overgrown with moss and ivy, their stone benches cracked by time. And in their place across Europe's hills and valleys, a new kind of city had risen, one without sewers, without drains, without memory. This was the medieval world. From the 5th century onward, as kingdoms replaced empires and faith became the strongest law, Europe entered a long, slow forgetting. The knowledge of sanitation, once public and proud, was now relegated to whispers and myths. Toilets became crude, personal, and hidden. Hygiene was no longer sacred, it was suspect. The cities that rose, Paris, London, Cologne, Florence, grew faster than they could clean themselves. Narrow, winding streets packed with wooden buildings leaned precariously toward one another. People lived stacked on top of one another, and beneath it all, the waste piled high. Gone were the Roman drains. In their place, chamber pots. The chamber pot, a simple ceramic bowl, often stored beneath the bed, was now the primary means of relieving oneself. In the quiet hours of dawn or the middle of a rainy night, the pot was pulled out, squatted over, and used. There was no flushing, no rinsing, no sponge on a stick. When it filled, it was dumped off and out the nearest window. "Gardez l'eau," the French would cry, "Watch out for the water." But it wasn't water. It was urine, feces, the contents of every humble home. The phrase, shouted from upper windows, was a ritual of survival. Those below knew to step aside, quickly. In some cities, regulations were passed. London, in the 14th century, tried to limit waste dumping to nighttime. Paris banned the act near churches. But enforcement was rare. Streets were soaked, gutters overflowed. In summer, the smell was unbearable. In winter, it froze in the gutter, silent and waiting. And yet, among all this, castles still stood. In those fortified stone walls, sanitation took on a peculiar twist. The nobility did not squat over pots. They sat on thrones, literal wooden seats, often built into the stone walls of towers, with holes leading to vertical shafts called garderobes. These shafts emptied into moats, pits, or simply the open air. The word garderobe is revealing. It means to guard one's robes. Clothes were often hung near these shafts, the ammonia fumes believed to repel moths and lice, toilets as closets, fumes as insecticide. Such was the strange logic of medieval hygiene. Garderobes varied. Some were elaborate, a small stone room with a bench and a view of the countryside. Others were terrifying, high, narrow drops into cesspits below. Cleaning them was rare, dangerous, unthinkable. Pity the servant whose task it was to empty a castle's waste pit. Some garderobes even hung over rivers in elegant solution until the river dried or the tide turned. Yet even among the filth, modest innovation crept in. Monasteries, those quiet centers of thought and prayer, sometimes preserved Roman ideas. The latrina, a communal toilet used by monks, was built with running water beneath. Monks in Cluny, for example, built lavatories over small streams. Silence was observed. Cleanliness, if not comfort, was maintained. Monasteries also understood disease. Though they lacked germ theory, they saw patterns. Waste led to sickness. Stagnant water brought death. In their cloistered worlds, small sanitary systems survived, but outside their walls, Europe festered. Bathing, too, became controversial. Early on, public bathhouses thrived, especially in places like southern France or the Low Countries, but over time these spaces became suspect. Associated with sin, promiscuity, or foreignness, the act of bathing was increasingly avoided. Some feared that water opened the skin to disease. Better to remain dry, covered in linen, and protected by fabric. Perfume replaced soap. Herbs replaced baths. White shirts were changed frequently. Clean clothing came to symbolize a clean body. The idea of washing was replaced with covering, a fiction, but one that lingered. Toilets, if they existed, were rarely discussed. Manuals of etiquette mentioned them only in whispers. Royal palaces might contain elaborate wooden seats. But even kings relied on grooms of the stool servants whose duty was to assist in their master's defecation. A position both intimate and powerful, it placed one literally at the rear of power. Still, the stench grew. Waste piled in the streets. Rivers darkened with runoff. Wells were contaminated. Rats feasted. And then, in the 14th century, the price was paid. The Black Death swept across Europe like a shadow. 1/3 of the population vanished. Cities emptied. Fields lay fallow. And though the disease was carried by fleas and rats, worsened by trade routes and climate shifts, the filth did not help. Crowded homes, unwashed bodies, contaminated water, it all fed the fire. After the plague, cities began to ask, what had gone wrong? Sanitation became a question again. Latrine pits were dug deeper. Some cities built rudimentary sewer channels. Cesspit cleaning became a trade. Regulations on dumping were slowly enforced. But change came slowly, hesitantly. In Renaissance Florence, for example, wealthy homes had indoor toilets piped to cesspits lined with brick, but most still used pots and privies. In Tudor London, privies were shared by multiple homes, their waste collected by men called gong farmers who worked only at night in silence for a wage paid in silver and shame. And so Europe limped forward. Not yet clean, but no longer entirely blind to its own filth. Toilets had gone from marble to wood, from communal to personal, from sacred to silent. Forgotten, ignored, and then slowly rediscovered. But even as the West struggled to remember what it once knew, other parts of the world were innovating. In far-off China, a dynasty was laying brick by brick, not just walls, but toilets that flushed. And in Japan, a quiet revolution of cleanliness was already underway. While Europe floundered in the fog of unwashed centuries, far across deserts and mountains in the valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, a different world endured. In China, vast, layered, eternal civilization had never quite forgotten how to be clean. Here, dynasties rose and fell like the moon, but one truth remained constant: order begins with water. And in this land of scholars and emperors, of porcelain and poetry, the toilet was quietly transforming. Long before the flush became a Western marvel, China was building systems that worked. The earliest signs go back as far as the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE. In the ruins of palaces and estates, archaeologists have uncovered something extraordinary: stone seats set over ceramic or wooden containers, connected to sloped channels. These weren't holes in the ground. These were latrines with design. One of the oldest known flush toilets in the world was discovered in the ancient capital of Yuan. In a high-ranking official's home, the toilet was set above a slanted pipe, with a nearby water tank perhaps manually filled that allowed water to be poured after use. Waste was washed down into a cesspool or collection tank. This was not a one-off. Other sites from the Western Han show similar features: tiled channels, pit latrines with airflow design, and even privacy screens. Unlike the crudeness of European privies, Chinese toilets even in antiquity reflected thought, engineering, quiet elegance. But innovation was not just for the elite. In common homes, especially in rural villages, simpler systems were used. Wooden or ceramic buckets, known as night soil pots, were emptied each morning. The waste was not discarded, it was valued. Farmers collected it, stored it, and used it to fertilize fields. Night soil was quite literally human gold. It became part of a complex agricultural economy. Special collectors, often entire families, ran night soil operations, moving door to door in cities like Chang'an, Luoyang, and later Hangzhou and Beijing. They gathered waste not to remove it, but to repurpose it. There was no shame, only utility. By the Tang Dynasty, public latrines appeared in cities and along trade roads. Tea houses had them. Inns included small, enclosed stalls, squat style, with water channels or sand buckets. Some used ash to cover waste. Others installed basic drainage systems leading to holding pits. Meanwhile, bathhouses, though less central than in Rome or the Islamic world, still offered places for washing. Temples maintained ablution pools. Buddhist monks practiced regular cleansing rituals. Taoist texts advise balance through purity, both spiritual and physical. Yet the true revolution came not with buckets, but with paper. Sometime in the 6th century CE, the Chinese began using paper for personal cleaning. Not scrolls or silk knot for the elite only, but soft, recycled paper. By the Tang Dynasty, records mention paper specifically manufactured for toilet use. By the Song Dynasty, factories in Zhejiang produced millions of sheets annually, some measuring 2 feet square. This was centuries before Europe would even imagine such a luxury. And so, while nobles in France sat above holes with no wiping tools, Chinese officials had scented, water-softened sheets designed for hygiene. Even the emperor was not exempt. The Ming court, in the 14th century, ordered 720,000 sheets of perfumed toilet paper for palace use. Each sheet, delicately embossed, folded with care. The Ming and Qing dynasties brought further refinement. In imperial palaces like the Forbidden City, toilets became part of interior architecture. Private quarters featured squat latrines over ceramic bowls, which were emptied daily by eunuchs or servants. Some had water jars nearby. Others included steam or ash to control odor. In colder regions, chamber pots were made of bronze or thick porcelain, their lids carved with dragons or phoenixes decoration atop practicality. Even more fascinating were the portable toilets used by the nobility while traveling. Some were built into ornate boxes, carried by servants. Others resembled miniature thrones with drawers that could be removed and cleaned. Hygiene, even on the road, was never left to chance. In cities, latrine design evolved with population growth. Street toilet simple stalls with wooden covers served entire neighborhoods. Waste was removed by government-regulated collectors and sold to farmers outside the walls. Urban planning included sewage ditches, though primitive by modern standards. They represented a city's attempt to live alongside its own refuse. The language of toilets changed too. Euphemisms arose: thatched hut, perfume chamber, rear courtyard. But the act was never cloaked in shame. Literature, plays, and satire often referenced toilet habits. One Ming-era novel includes a joke about a man who bragged about his bowel movements as a sign of health. Another poem describes the quiet relief of a winter latrine, the steam rising from a warmed pot. The Chinese understanding of cleanliness was rooted in balance. Not just the removal of waste, but the careful reuse of it. Not only water, but paper, not simply toilets, but systems. Disease, though present, was mitigated by this awareness. Cholera, dysentery, and parasites were known dangers, but the widespread use of latrines and the collection of waste kept outbreaks lower than in many Western cities. While medieval London bathed once a year, Chinese peasants washed daily in rivers and streams, their toilet pots rinsed before sunrise. Still, problems remained. Overcrowded cities strained waste systems. Night soil collectors could not always keep pace. In dry seasons, waste dried into thick crusts. In rain, it flooded into alleys. But the principle remained. Waste must be moved, managed, transformed. And the toilet, humble and silent, was at the center of it all. By the 18th century, China had centuries of sanitation experience. It had paper, it had infrastructure, it had cultural memory, but it lacked one thing: industrialization. Europe was about to explode with machines, plumbing, and pipes of steel. And from a small island in the North Sea, a quiet whisper was rising: flush, flush, flush. The modern toilet was coming. But first, in the East, one more land must be visited, a land of ritual, bamboo, and serenity. Japan, where toilets became art. In the mists of time, where mountains meet the sea and cherry blossoms fall like snow, Japan was crafting something rare, a civilization where beauty and cleanliness were never apart. And in this land of tea ceremonies, sliding doors, and raked sand gardens, even the toilet became a canvas of aesthetic refinement. The Japanese did not always have the world's cleanest toilets, but they always had something more enduring: reverence for the act of cleansing. The story begins quietly in the Heian period, an age of poets and courtiers. At the imperial court in Kyoto, nobles in flowing silk robes wrote verses by candlelight and bathed in perfumed water. Cleanliness was a ritual not merely physical, but social. A clean body was a mark of class. Odors were avoided with incense. Hair was oiled, hands were washed. But what of toilets? They were humble, squat latrines, built behind walls of wood and paper, chamber pots in quiet corners. Even in the palaces, defecation was a matter of discretion. The pots were ceramic or lacquered wood, emptied regularly by attendants. Outside the court, peasants relieved themselves in fields and forests. Nature was their privy. Yet a seed had been planted, the idea that purity was close to godliness. This was reinforced by Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan. Shinto held that certain things were inherently impure: death, blood, and yes, excrement. The body could be polluted, and so it must be cleansed. Ritual washing misogi became central. Before entering a shrine, one had to wash hands and mouth. In many shrines, latrines were located far from sacred spaces, sometimes in separate buildings entirely. And then there was Buddhism, imported from China and Korea. Monasteries adopted strict codes of hygiene. Monks cleaned latrines daily. Water was always present for ablution. The Vinaya, a Buddhist monastic code, detailed how to relieve oneself properly, where to look, how to wash, how to remain mindful even in the act of defecation. Thus, by the Kamakura period, latrines in monasteries were more advanced than those in castles. Some had basic drainage. Others used ash to cover waste. Cleanliness was an act of compassion for the self, for others, for the world. But it wasn't until the Edo period that Japan's toilets began to bloom. This was the age of samurai and merchants, woodblock prints and haiku. Cities like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto swelled with life. Urban planning was tight, ordered, efficient. And in the back alleys of these wooden cities, a revolution in sanitation quietly unfolded. The Japanese, ever pragmatic, embraced the value of human waste. Like the Chinese, they collected night soil called shimo from every home. Merchants went door to door with wooden carts, paying residents for their excrement. The richer the household, the higher the price. Why? Because wealthy diets made for better fertilizer. Waste became economy. A single scoop could feed rice fields and vegetable plots. Toilets in Edo were simple but smart, wooden platforms with a hole above a ceramic or bamboo-lined container. The waste was collected, transported, and sold. There were few open sewers, few piles of refuse. In a city of 1 million people, cleanliness was maintained not with pipes but with purpose. Public toilets existed too. In temples, inns, and roadside stations, especially on the famous Tokaido Road, travelers could relieve themselves in communal stalls. Signage directed users. Buckets of water stood nearby for washing. The system wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And it smelled less than one might expect. That's because ash or sawdust was often sprinkled over waste. The containers were cleaned regularly, and the Japanese obsession with fragrance and scents, herbal sachets, camphor would help mask what could not be avoided. Even toilet rooms, especially in the homes of the well-to-do, were decorated with ikebana, calligraphy, or painted screens. Toilets were not places of shame. They were part of the home, and in some ways an extension of one's character. But perhaps most symbolic was the toilet god. Yes, in Japanese folklore, a deity named Kawaii no Kami was believed to reside in the toilet. Offerings were made to ensure a healthy childbirth or to prevent accidents. Children were taught to respect the toilet, to keep it clean, to never speak rudely while inside. Songs were even sung to the toilet god. It was superstition, yes, but also reverence. In some Shinto shrines, especially older ones, a small altar might be found near the latrine offering thanks to Kawaii no Kami for keeping disease at bay. The latrine, no longer just functional, was now spiritual. And so, centuries passed. The toilets remained squat-style, often with ceramic basins, but water use increased. In some samurai estates, indoor latrines were connected to private gardens, allowing waste to feed flowers. In Buddhist temples, latrines were positioned to catch sunlight and wind, to stay dry and odor-free. The very layout of architecture was shaped by sanitation. Then came the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century. Westernization arrived. Plumbing followed. The Japanese did not immediately abandon their traditional toilets, but they studied foreign systems. Engineers traveled to London, to Paris, to Boston. They saw sewers, pipes, porcelain flush mechanisms. And soon, Japan began building its own. In Tokyo and Osaka, sewer systems were planned. In modern hotels and government buildings, Western-style seated toilets appeared first rare, then common. But instead of simply copying, Japan adapted, they hybridized. Today, that hybrid has become legend, the washlet. A fusion of tradition and technology, heated seats, bidet functions, air dryers, deodorizing mist, music, flushing sounds, and even blue nightlights, all to maintain modesty, hygiene, and serenity. But these miracles of technology didn't come from nowhere. They are the flowering of a deep-rooted belief that the act of cleansing is both personal and profound, that a toilet is not just a bowl, but a space to reflect, to purify, to begin again. In Japan, you do not simply use the toilet, you enter a moment of pause, of quiet dignity, of gratitude to the unseen mechanisms that carry your burdens away. And from that stillness, another revolution was coming, one not of steam or silk, but of steel and invention. For in the industrial cities of 19th century Europe, a new toilet was about to emerge. With levers, with pipes, with a thunderous flush. In the heart of 19th century England, among fog-choked alleys and gaslit streets, the toilet became a battleground between tradition and progress. This was the age of empire, coal, and invention, but it was also the age of stench. London stank. Its river, the Thames, had become a slow-moving sewer. Human waste poured into it from thousands of homes. Privies overflowed. Chamber pots were dumped into gutters. Night soil collectors, once part of a semi-respectable trade, had dwindled. The city had outgrown its own excrement, and the smell would not go away. The rich retreated to mansions with separate outhouses. The poor used back alley cesspits or worse, public streets. Disease spread. Typhoid, dysentery, and most terrifying of all, cholera. It struck without warning. One day, a man was alive. The next, he collapsed in the street, his lips blue, his body drained of water. Londoners whispered that the air itself was poisoned. They were half right. It wasn't the air. It was the water fouled by human waste, but they didn't know that yet. The science wasn't there. Not yet. And then came the great stink. In the summer of 1858, as the Thames shrank under the sun and the heat rose like a fever, the smell became unbearable. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime. Parliamentary meetings were cancelled. Members of Parliament fled Westminster as the river festered beneath their windows. The newspapers called it the Great Stink. The people called it a curse. But historians would one day call it the moment sanitation changed forever. And behind it all was a quiet revolution, the rise of the flush toilet. The idea wasn't new. Centuries earlier, Sir John Harington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, had invented a flushing toilet in 1596. It involved a cistern above a bowl, water released with a valve. But it was expensive, leaky, and ahead of its time. Harrington's invention went mostly ignored except by the Queen, who had one installed in her palace. For 200 years, no one cared. But by the early 1800s, London's problems could no longer be ignored, and so inventors tried again. Enter Alexander Cumming, a Scottish watchmaker, who in 1775 patented a critical improvement, the S-trap. This simple curve in the pipe held water between the bowl and the drain, preventing odors from rising back into the room. It was quiet genius, and it worked. Then came Joseph Bramah, who improved the valve system and made flushing more efficient. Then George Jennings, who brought toilets to the public. In 1851, at the Great Exhibition in Crystal Palace, Jennings installed monkey closets, flush toilets open to visitors for a penny. Over 800,000 people used them. And suddenly the flush was no longer a novelty, it was desirable. But none of these men solved the core issue, where the waste went. Because flushing a toilet was one thing. Disposing of the contents was another. In early Victorian homes, flush toilets often emptied directly into cesspits or old medieval drains designed only for rain. The result? Clogged streets, overflowing basements, contaminated wells. That's when the engineers stepped in. The hero of this underground war was Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of London's Metropolitan Board of Works. In the aftermath of the Great Stink, Parliament gave him the power and the money to clean the city. His plan was bold, a vast underground network of intercepting sewers stretching for miles beneath the city. Brick tunnels carved by hand, pumping stations, outfalls far downriver. The system would carry waste away from homes and away from people. Construction took years. Hundreds died. Thousands labored in darkness and filth. But when it was done, London changed. Cholera vanished. The river cleared. And flush toilets finally had a home. By the 1870s, toilets were in every upper-class house. By the 1890s, the middle class had them too. Even the poor had shared facilities connected, at last, to something greater than a ditch. But not all was perfect. Early flush toilets used enormous amounts of water. Some had tanks that held up to 10 gallons. The force of flushing could shake walls. And if a pipe burst, it wasn't just water that came out. Moreover, people were still learning how to use them. Etiquette guides emerged. Instructions were printed. Do not throw paper, fabric, or food into the water closet. Do not flush more than once per use. Gentlemen, kindly lift the seat. And of course the language changed. Privy became water closet, or WC night soil became sewage. Toilet, originally a French word for grooming, now meant the apparatus itself. Flush toilets spread across the British Empire, India, Hong Kong, Africa, the Caribbean. The British brought pipes wherever they went. In some colonies, they were symbols of civilization. In others, they were rejected, seen as foreign, disruptive, or unnecessary. But in London, Paris, and New York, the flush was unstoppable. In America, similar battles were fought. Cities like Chicago and Boston developed their own sewer systems. Plumbing codes were written. Toilet manufacturers like Thomas Crapper, whose name became legend, mass-produced elegant porcelain bowls. With polished oak seats and brass handles, Crapper did not invent the toilet, but he marketed it. He made it respectable. By the end of the 19th century, the flush toilet was a fixture in homes, hotels, and railway stations. Manufacturers competed over elegance. Some featured gold-plated handles. Others had hand-painted basins. Toilets became a symbol not just of hygiene, but of modernity. Still, problems remained. Sewage treatment was primitive. Many cities dumped waste directly into rivers or oceans. Diseases lingered. Water shortages became a concern, and cultural taboos remained. Many still refused to speak of toilets in polite society. But the dam had broken, the flush had come. and with it, a new kind of cleanliness, one powered not by superstition or ceremony, but by mechanics. In the bowels of the Victorian home, behind velvet curtains and ticking clocks, a quiet revolution had taken place. And what began with squalor, death, and stink, ended in gleaming porcelain. In a desert born of dust and fire, where the sun scorches stone and wind whips across endless dunes, a new idea was carried not in scrolls, but in the verses of a book. That idea was Tahara, the pursuit of ritual purity. And it would transform how entire civilizations viewed toilets, hygiene, and the very act of living clean. To be Muslim was to be clean. From the 7th century onward, Islamic teachings placed extraordinary emphasis on hygiene. In fact, among the first verses revealed to the Prophet Muhammad was the command to purify thy garments. The Quran itself made cleanliness a precondition to prayer. Before worship, a Muslim must wash face, hands, arms, feet in a sacred act known as wudu. And if water could not be found, then clean sand would suffice, through a symbolic cleansing called tayammum. But it went further. Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh devoted entire chapters to istinja, the act of cleaning oneself after using the toilet. This was not just a recommendation, it was required. And so, where early medieval Europe feared water, the Islamic world built fountains. Where Christians viewed bodily functions with shame, Muslims saw the human body as a trust from God, to be kept pure. It wasn't merely theology, it was urban design. In cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Damascus, and Cairo, toilets were integrated into every mosque, school, and home. No community could be considered civilized without them. Even the most modest house had a small, private latrine, always located away from the cooking area, often connected to flowing water. Some were rudimentary holes in the ground, flushed with buckets of water. Others, especially in elite homes, were sophisticated, tiled floors, ceramic squat pans, drains angled for gravity-fed flushing. In palaces, latrines featured marble seats and basins with carved stone for washing. Servants refilled water jars daily. Fragrant herbs hung from the walls to neutralize smell. Scented oils were dabbed on the body after cleaning. Even in prison cells, as chronicled in accounts from 10th century Andalusia, the presence of a water jug for cleansing was considered a bare necessity. But the key difference was not luxury, it was routine. A Muslim might use the toilet 5 times a day. Why? Because 5 times a day they would perform salat, the ritual prayer, and each time they must be clean. This constant rhythm made hygiene habitual, automatic, part of the fabric of life. To aid this, a set of etiquette developed, codified in hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet. Before entering the toilet, one said a short prayer. "O Allah, I seek refuge in you from filth and impurity." One stepped in with the left foot and out with the right. One never faced Mecca while relieving oneself, a sign of reverence for the holy city. And one always used water for cleansing, a practice so ingrained that toilet paper alone was insufficient in Islamic law, the tool of choice. The lota, a small water vessel, often made of brass or ceramic, shaped like a teardrop with a spout. Some had intricate calligraphy carved into them. Others were plain, but always functional. Public toilets were common, and they weren't just holes in the ground. In larger cities, especially during the Abbasid and Umayyad caliphates, bathhouses or hammams served as centers of hygiene. Attached to many of these were latrines, ventilated, cleaned daily, often featuring running water from aqueducts. These facilities were communal, but modesty was maintained by partitions and staggered use. Architects considered airflow, drainage, and odor control. Ventilation shafts pulled stale air upward. Drains were angled to prevent backflow. In some elite areas, cesspits were connected to clay pipes, leading to distant disposal zones outside the city, centuries ahead of London or Paris. Even more remarkable was the use of perfume. The Islamic world, being at the crossroads of trade, had access to spices and oils from India, Persia, and Africa. Incense was burned near latrines. Oils were applied after bathing. Cleanliness didn't just mean being free of dirt. It meant smelling good, for oneself, for one's spouse, for one's soul. The famous 10th century physician Al-Razi wrote extensively on hygiene. He described proper bowel habits, frequency of defecation, and even recommended foods that improved digestion. His work was echoed by Avicenna, who insisted that regular cleansing prevented disease, an idea that would take the West 700 more years to adopt. In Al-Andalus, the Islamic Spain of poets and philosophers, hygiene reached new heights. Toilets were built into homes with drains lined in glazed tile. Latrines connected to sewer channels under the city. The royal palace at Medina Azahara, near Cordoba, had a sophisticated water supply, with toilets positioned near baths, not hidden, but part of the architectural flow. Even travelers noted it. When Christian pilgrims and merchants visited cities like Cairo or Granada, they were astonished to see men washing their hands and feet in public fountains. In one account, a Frankish knight describes his bewilderment at a toilet that washed itself, clearly describing a simple gravity flush pan. This reverence for purity even extended to death. Islamic burial rituals require washing the body, a final act of cleansing before the soul's departure. And just as the living cleaned themselves for prayer, so too was the dead body purified, wrapped in linen, and buried without delay. This continuity of water, of prayer, of cleanliness linked every moment of life. From cradle to grave, the act of washing was holy. And so, centuries before Victorian flushes and Renaissance plumbing, the Islamic world had already laid down the principles of modern sanitation, regular washing, water-based toilets, urban drainage, and public health. It wasn't perfect. Not every village had latrines, disease still spread, but the philosophy was in place and it shaped generations. Even today, many Muslim-majority countries maintain the practice of water cleansing after toilet use. The Loda lives on in plastic, metal, ceramic, in bathrooms from Morocco to Malaysia. And where modern bidets now spray with electronic precision, they merely echo what was already known, that cleansing with water is not just functional, but beautiful. Next, we turn to a continent rich in diversity, tradition, and innovation, where toilets took many forms and hygiene meant harmony with the land. In the red dust of the Sahel, where baobab trees stretch their arms like sentinels, and termite mounds rise like towers from the earth, the traces of old cities lie buried. Their stones whisper, their walls remember, and among the remnants of trade, art, and empire lie the quiet remains of toilets, humble, carved, and essential. Africa's sanitation story is not uniform. It is a tapestry woven from forest kingdoms and desert oases, highland fortresses, and coastal ports. But one thing binds them, a reverence for the land. To pollute the earth was not just foolish, it was taboo. In the ancient city of Great Zimbabwe, whose stone walls still rise above the savannah, archaeologists found evidence of intentional drainage systems. These were not just rain gutters, they channeled waste away from living spaces. Some historians believe certain stone enclosures served dual purposes, gathering places by day, latrine zones by night. Charcoal, ash, and decomposed organic waste suggest that waste was buried, covered, or burned, never left to linger. But the most compelling evidence of African sanitation comes not from monuments but from urban planning. Take Gengeno, one of sub-Saharan Africa's oldest cities, located in modern-day Mali. Flourishing from around 250 BCE, Gen was a city of mud brick homes, narrow alleys, and elevated walkways. Amid the stratified layers of occupation, archaeologists found deep refuse pits, some containing latrine waste, ash, and animal bones. These pits were intentional, dug deep to keep the settlement clean. And unlike European cesspits that festered near kitchens or bedrooms, Gen's pits were removed from domestic centers. They were aerated, sun-baked, and regularly covered. In Mali's later empires, especially under rulers like Mansa Musa, sanitation was seen as a reflection of Islamic influence. Mosques in Timbuktu and Gao included toilet areas, washed with water drawn from nearby wells. Clay pipes carried waste beyond the city center. And as Islamic jurisprudence merged with African tradition, cleanliness became both ritual and responsibility. Further east, in the highlands of Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum left behind another story. Aksum, a bustling empire from the 1st to 7th centuries CE, traded with Rome, Byzantium, and India. Its cities were planned with terraces, and stone homes sometimes included small enclosed chambers, interpreted by some scholars as latrine spaces with runoff channeled downslope. Nearby, refuse fields acted as natural compost zones, where human and animal waste broke down under the tropical sun, eventually returned to the soil as fertilizer. But sanitation wasn't just about removal, it was about balance. In many African societies, the handling of human waste fell under the care of certain castes or ritual specialists, often respected for their role in maintaining community purity. These individuals oversaw burial grounds, compost pits, and latrine sites. Some were seen as spiritually protected from impurity, others held complex social roles. Among the Yoruba of West Africa, waste was not discarded thoughtlessly. It was covered, returned to the earth, or burned. Traditional Yoruba compounds included small latrine zones near the periphery, always separate from food or sleeping areas. The Igbo and Hausa also maintained strict spatial separations between pure and impure zones. And the Zulu of southern Africa practiced something remarkably sustainable, a form of dry sanitation. In rural Zulu settlements, waste was often collected in shallow latrine pits, then periodically filled with ash or leaves to speed decomposition and reduce smell. Some of these pits were relocated yearly, what we now call rotational pit latrines, a practice advocated today by sanitation engineers. It wasn't a system born of science, it was born of intuition and observation. The flies stayed away, the soil stayed rich, disease didn't spread, and the land, always sacred, remained undesecrated. Yet despite all this, the European colonial powers would later claim that Africa lacked sanitation. They arrived with their own waste, overflowing barracks, outhouses with no drainage, diseases they didn't understand. But they looked at African customs and saw only primitiveness. In truth, many colonial towns suffered worse sanitation than the indigenous settlements they displaced. In Lamu, a Swahili coastal city that had practiced Islamic sanitation for centuries, British planners installed latrines with no drainage, causing outbreaks of cholera. In Kampala, Ugandan sanitation officials abandoned local pit designs for Western cesspits, which collapsed in the tropical rains. The result? Stagnant waste, epidemics. The insult was not just technological, it was cultural. Colonizers imposed shame where none had existed. Toileting, once private but unashamed, became taboo. Ritual cleansing, once sacred, was mocked. The loda was replaced with civilized toilet paper. Pit toilets were called backward, even as they functioned better in dry zones than the Western flush ever could, but still, the old ways endured. In many rural parts of Africa today, ancient wisdom still lives. In Ghana, the KVIP, developed in the 1980s, draws directly from traditional pit designs but with better ventilation. It's low cost, low maintenance, and still one of the most successful sanitation solutions on the continent. In Ethiopia's Tukul houses, latrines are still built with ash pits and angled runoff. In Nigeria, compost toilets return waste to soil. And in Kenya, community-led sanitation projects have revived old methods, covering, rotating, respecting. The lesson is clear: Africa's sanitation was never primitive. It was adapted, responsive, integrated with the land. And unlike the cities of medieval Europe, whose waste ran ankle-deep in the streets, Africa's ancient cities made waste vanish into the sun, into the soil, into the rhythm of the seasons. The land remembers, the earth digests, and the people always clean themselves before the gods. Before the jungle swallowed their cities, before the Spanish burned their codices and stole their gold, the peoples of Mesoamerica and the Andes had already built civilizations that soared in complexity. They charted Venus, they tamed mountains, they engineered roads that crossed continents, and they also built toilets. Sanitation, like astronomy or architecture, was no afterthought. It was sacred engineering. Let us begin in the steaming forests of the Yucatan. Here, the Maya carved their cities from limestone and lit them with fire. At Palenque, one of their most refined cities, the ruins whisper of water. Aqueducts, channeled through the hills, carried fresh water into palace courtyards. But more remarkably, wastewater flowed out. Palenque's royal compound included early versions of drains and latrines. Beneath the Temple of the Inscriptions, archaeologists discovered a complex of channels that whisked away waste and rainwater alike. Gravity did the work. Stone linings kept it clean. These systems didn't just serve the royal family, they served the gods. Sanitation was spiritual. To defecate was not simply biological. It was symbolic. In Maya mythology, Xibalba, the underworld, was a watery place, dark, putrid, but sacred. Waste was destined for it, and so it had to be guided. Toilets were often placed at the back of homes, facing downward slopes. Waste flowed into hidden gullies, later covered in lime and ash. The Aztecs, far to the northwest in the Valley of Mexico, took sanitation even further. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a marvel. Floating gardens, causeways, temples that touched the clouds, and a system of public latrines so advanced it stunned the Spaniards. By the 15th century, Tenochtitlan had over 200,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Yet, according to records from Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the city did not stink. How? First, Aztec homes featured chamber pots, usually clay, emptied daily by night soil collectors. These waste gatherers were not lowly, they were essential. Their collections didn't go to sewers, they went to farms. Human waste was dried, mixed with ash, and used as fertilizer in the chinampas, the floating gardens that fed the city. Even urine was saved. Rich in ammonia, it was used for tanning hides, cleaning clothes, and even setting dyes. But the Aztecs were more than just efficient, they were fastidious. The philosopher King Nezahualcóyotl, poet and engineer, oversaw the construction of an aqueduct system that not only supplied fresh water but included wastewater management. Toilets in noble homes featured stone-lined pits flushed with buckets or diverted to channels, leading into Lake Texcoco, whose brackish water served as a buffer between human waste and potable sources. Public bathhouses existed, especially near the edge of the lake. Steam baths, or temazcales, dotted the city where sweat, water, and waste were flushed out in rhythmic cycles of purification. To bathe, to relieve oneself, to clean, these were not chores. They were acts of balance between the body and the cosmos. Then came the Andes. High above the clouds, in the vertical kingdom of the Inca, sanitation took another form, one adapted to gravity, stone, and sacred geography. At the heart of this empire lay Machu Picchu, the lost city that hid in the clouds until 1911. But when the mist lifted, it revealed an astonishing secret, a plumbing system. Machu Picchu, built in the 15th century, had a population of around 750 elite residents. Yet it featured 16 fountains, fed by a mountain spring and connected through a series of precisely cut stone channels. These weren't just decorative. They supplied drinking water, bathing water, and toilet water. In the royal sector, archaeologists uncovered latrine-like structures with drainage stones and angled floors. Waste flowed downslope, away from living quarters. The Inca, master masons that they were, built everything with incline in mind. Even their sewage obeyed the laws of altitude. In larger cities like Cusco, the pattern continued. Waste channels beneath streets carried runoff away from homes. Dry waste was collected and spread on agricultural terraces. Like the Aztecs, the Inca saw no shame in recycling the body's leavings. It was a return to the Pachamama, the Earth Mother. Cleanliness was never merely medical. It was spiritual economy. The Inca elite bathed regularly. Steam baths, similar to the Temazcal, were carved into rock. Shamans oversaw ritual purgings. Festivals often included mass cleansings, both literal and symbolic. But even among commoners, toilets were respected. Simple pit latrines were dug away from the home, often near cultivated fields. Waste was buried in soil and ash. Water sources were guarded fiercely. Contamination was an offense not just against health, but against divine order. And just as Maya gods ruled the underworld, Andean deities watched the mountains. To pollute a stream was to anger the Apis, the mountain spirits. To defecate near a sacred spring was to invite drought. This belief system didn't just prevent contamination, it enforced ecological sanitation centuries before the term existed. Yet for all their brilliance, these systems would be lost. The Spanish did not understand them. They saw composting as primitive, They mocked the use of urine. They dug latrines near wells. They replaced dry latrines with foul cesspits. And the cities they built, Lima, Quito, Mexico City, often lacked the sanitation of the cities they had burned. Still, the echoes remained. In rural Mexico and Peru, farmers still use dry toilets. Urine is still used to treat cloth and hides. Ash-covered composting pits survive in Andean villages. Even the Temazcal is reborn in spas and homes its hot breath, carrying memories of a time when hygiene was harmony. We remember Machu Picchu for its terraces, its walls, its view. But its toilets tell a quieter story of people who, thousands of meters above sea level, still found a way to live clean. Next, we head to ancient China and Korea, where waste was collected with precision, recycled with brilliance, and even used to power rice fields and orchards in one of the most elegant sanitation cycles the world has ever known. Somewhere beneath the misty willows of the Yangtze, between bamboo groves and rice paddies, lies the heart of one of the world's most advanced and ancient sanitation systems. It did not roar with aqueducts like Rome, nor gleam with marble like Greece. It whispered through ritual, routine, and reverence, and it began, always, with a simple wooden bucket. In ancient China, waste was not something to be flushed away. It was something to be collected, valued, and returned. A cycle between earth and stomach, field and toilet, rice and refuse, that would last more than 2 millennia. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, early texts like the Rites of Zhou described not just manners but sanitation guidelines. Toilets, known as seashells, were separate from living quarters. Some were simple trenches, others lined with ceramic tiles or bricks. Wealthier households built enclosed latrines with curved clay roofs to divert odor and a slot for a night pot. But the truly unique feature of China's sanitation was its use of human waste, respectfully termed night soil. By the Han Dynasty, night soil collectors became a familiar sight in cities. Before sunrise, they would move from door to door with yoke and pail, retrieving waste from porcelain or ceramic chamber pots. This wasn't charity. It was commerce. Human excrement was one of China's most valuable agricultural commodities. It was composted, often with straw or ash, then carefully aged and spread on rice paddies, tea plantations, and vegetable farms. In regions like the Yangtze Delta, the fertility of the land depended not just on rivers but on toilets. This system was stunningly efficient. One urban household's waste could feed half an acre of farmland for a year. Nothing was wasted. Not even urine, which was used in dyeing cloth and cleaning tools. And hygiene was never ignored. Even in bustling cities like Chang'an, toilets were regulated. Public latrines were often segregated by gender, positioned near bathhouses or tea houses, and cleaned daily. Wooden floorboards were sanded smooth, buckets replaced, and waste carried out by state-contracted workers. The Confucian emphasis on order and propriety extended to the realm of excretion. One did not defecate near temples or wells. One did not let waste touch sacred plants. One used toilet paper, yes. Invented in China by at least the 6th century CE, early toilet paper was made of rice straw pulp, soft yet fibrous. It was cut into squares, sometimes even perfumed for the elite. By the 14th century, under the Ming Dynasty, records note the imperial court commissioning hundreds of thousands of paper sheets for the emperor's personal use. The term was zizi, paper for the bottom, but not everything was elegant. Cities struggled with scale. During the Song Dynasty, which oversaw vast urban expansion, sanitation became a balancing act. More people meant more waste. Night soil guilds became powerful. City ordinances mandated covered pits, sealed containers, and periodic inspections. And yet, even amid the chaos of market stalls, fireworks, and riverboats, Song-era cities remained relatively clean. Then came Korea, watching and learning, but building its own legacy. The Three Kingdoms period saw the emergence of cities like Jeonju, capital of Silla. Here, archaeology reveals homes with stone-lined toilet pits, sometimes paired with small clay drainage tiles. Waste was buried in shallow compost pits, a method still practiced in rural Korean villages today. But Korea's genius lay in its rural innovation. By the Joseon Dynasty, Korean farmers had mastered fermentation toilets. Human waste was stored in large clay jars with ash and rice husks, sealed tight to decompose anaerobically. After weeks of fermentation, the resulting compost was dark, odorless, and rich with nitrogen, perfect for ginseng, barley, or millet. Even village schools and Confucian academies maintained latrine gardens where waste was processed and returned to the soil. These weren't eyesores. They were miniature ecosystems. Cleanliness, too, was enforced by Neo-Confucian discipline. The Gyeongguk Daejin, Korea's great legal code, included laws about latrine placement, waste management, and even punishments for polluting streams. And the tools of hygiene? Simple and effective. In China and Korea alike, people used wash water rather than wiping. Ceramic loda vessels, wooden dippers, and hand-washing bowls were standard in toilet areas. Soap was made from plant ash and animal fat, boiled and cooled until solid. In more affluent homes, soap berries and lye were added for fragrance. Perhaps the most striking symbol of Korean sanitation was the ongi, the great clay, jar used for everything from kimchi to compost. An entire philosophy surrounded its use. Airtight yet breathing, sealed yet open to the sun. Night soil was not discarded, it was transformed. To pollute the land was to betray your ancestors. To keep it clean was an act of filial piety. This quiet sanitation empire would last for centuries. Only in the 20th century, with the rise of industrial fertilizers, did the night soil economy collapse. But even today, in some Chinese provinces and South Korean farms, the old composting toilets still breathe. And modern eco-sanitation movements now praise what ancient peasants knew all along, that nothing is waste, that every cycle returns, and that a toilet is not just a seat, it is a promise to the earth. The desert wind carried more than sand. It whispered secrets through the palm-fringed courtyards of Baghdad, echoed off the tiled domes of Cordoba, and flowed gently through the perfumed steam of the hammams of Damascus. Here, in the golden light of the 8th to 13th centuries, cleanliness was not merely a civic duty. It was a divine obligation. Islam, from its very beginning, had inscribed hygiene into the soul of its practice. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, declared that cleanliness is half of faith. With this foundation, Muslim cities from the Atlantic to the Indus developed some of the most advanced toilet systems, bathing infrastructure, and public sanitation laws of the medieval world. Let us begin in Baghdad, founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur. Designed as a perfect circle, mathematically precise, cosmologically symbolic, it was more than just a capital. It was a model of urban hygiene. Streets were wide and drained into covered channels. Each residential quarter had public latrines, strategically placed near mosques and markets. Toilets, known in Arabic as murhad or kala, were usually squat-style, a hole in the ground connected to a cesspit. In wealthier homes, these pits were lined with brick or ceramic tiles, allowing for drainage or periodic cleaning. Water, not cloth, was the tool of cleansing. Every toilet had a ghusl vessel or loda used for washing. The emphasis on ritual purity wudu and ghusl meant that bathrooms were placed with care. They were always built away from kitchens and prayer areas. Privacy, silence, and modesty were enforced even in excretion. But what truly separated Islamic sanitation was the integration of religious law with civic architecture. In the Islamic legal tradition, fiqh, there are entire chapters devoted to toilet etiquette. Do not face or turn your back to the Qibla while relieving yourself. Use the left hand for cleansing. Do not urinate near water sources. Bury solid waste when in the wild. Enter with the left foot. Exit with the right and say a prayer before and after. These rules were not superstition. They created a culture of spatial awareness, of environmental caution, centuries ahead of its time. In Cordoba, capital of Muslim Spain during the Umayyad Caliphate, sanitation reached levels unmatched in Europe for another 800 years. By the 10th century, Cordoba boasted hundreds of public baths, miles of stone sewers, and homes with indoor toilets, some flushing with running water. Latrines had sloping ceramic floors, ventilation shafts, and connections to wastewater canals that emptied far from the city center. In Al-Qarawiyyin, the oldest university in the world, Students had access to latrines with footrests, soap, and even instructions on proper use. The connection between knowledge and cleanliness was never severed. Waste collection was organized. Municipal city inspectors monitored streets, fined those who dumped excrement illegally, and ensured that waste carriers, known as zabalin, disposed of human waste in designated compost zones or farms. The Islamic world had no need for plagues to prompt sanitation reform. They were already doing it. Meanwhile, in Cairo, a city of over 500,000 by the 14th century, wastewater management became a science. Palatial homes had multi-room latrines, often adorned with mosaic tiles and intricate mashrabia screens for airflow. The Mamluk Sultanate invested in a network of underground drains, leading to the Nile desert areas beyond the city. Waste was never allowed to remain within. Soap making was a full industry, producing bars from olive oil, lye, and herbs. Toothbrushes were made from the miswak tree, and perfumed waters were used after bathing or relieving oneself. In Damascus and Istanbul, the glory of Islamic hygiene reached architectural heights, hammams or bathhouses. Though inspired by Roman baths, the hammam was transformed. Each bathhouse included a toilet section, basic, clean, and well ventilated, a changing room, a cold room, a warm room, a hot room with radiant floors heated by hypocausts. The experience was not just physical, it was spiritual renewal. Prayers were whispered, business was conducted, and bodies were scrubbed not just of dirt but of pride and sloth. Islamic engineers like Al-Jazari in the 13th century even designed mechanical flushing systems using gravity-fed water. His book of ingenious devices included automated toilets with rotating hand washers, water dispensing statues, and waste removal valves, a full 600 years before the modern flush. But perhaps the most important legacy was attitude. Unlike Europe, where excrement was often dumped from windows and bathing was seen as suspicious, the Islamic world celebrated purification. To be unclean was not just unpleasant, it was unlawful. Cities were designed around this truth. And yet, much of this would be forgotten. Colonial historians dismissed Islamic cities as chaotic and unhygienic, ignoring the night soil collectors, the bathhouse traditions, the multi-tiered waste systems. Orientalist painters lingered on the opium smoker, but ignored the soap maker. But the ruins speak. The hammams still stand, their domes pierced with star-shaped skylights. The latrines, though dry, still show their plumbing, and the manuscripts, carefully copied in ink and gold, still teach us how to sit, wash, and leave the toilet in a state of grace. Because in the Islamic Golden Age, a toilet was not an afterthought. It was a reflection of God's order, a tool of civic harmony, and a silent witness to the faith that cleanliness was half of belief. It was a world of stone towers and soot-darkened ceilings, of incense in chapels and rot in the gutters. Between candlelight and superstition, between plague and prayer, there lay the neglected and deeply misunderstood world of medieval sanitation. When the Roman Empire fell, so too did the art of sewage. The aqueducts dried, the sewers clogged. The baths turned to ruins, and with them, the belief that cleanliness could be a civic virtue. For 1,000 years, much of Europe forgot what Rome had known. That filth invites disease, and that waste must be moved far from where people live. In its place rose the garderobe. The word itself is deceptive. In French, it meant wardrobe, but in the castles of feudal Europe, it referred to the castle latrine, a hole built into the outer wall, where waste fell freely down a chute, sometimes into a moat, sometimes onto open ground. These weren't designed for sanitation. They were built for strategic convenience. Perched in turrets, towers, and corners, garderobes allowed nobility to relieve themselves in relative privacy. Some were stone alcoves with wooden seats. Others had vertical shafts, cleverly angled to keep the stench from wafting back in. One peculiar belief persisted, that hanging clothes in the garderobe warded off lice, the idea being that the ammonia fumes from human waste killed parasites. Hence, wardrobe became synonymous with a room of both defecation and storage. It was a grim kind of multitasking. In monasteries, where silence and order ruled, sanitation was approached with more care. The Great Cluniac and Cistercian orders built reredo orders, multi-seat communal latrines, usually positioned over running water. Waste would flow beneath through stone channels, sometimes directed from nearby rivers. These systems echoed Roman ingenuity, albeit on a smaller, monastic scale. Monks were often the only literate class to preserve ancient Roman texts on hygiene and medicine, and yet even they bathed infrequently. Water was cold. Bathing was considered a luxury, even a temptation. Cleanliness of the soul was prioritized over that of the body. In cities, the situation was far more dire. By the 13th century, London, Paris, and Cologne had grown into sprawling, chaotic hubs, but their waste systems had not evolved. Streets were narrow, unpaved, and often flooded. Open gutters, called kennels, ran along the center of roads, meant to carry rain and refuse away. But in practice, they became cesspools of rotting food, human waste, and animal dung. And then there were the chamber pots. Every household had them, ceramic, wooden, or pewter. In the absence of indoor plumbing, people relieved themselves indoors, then emptied the pot wherever was convenient, sometimes into designated cesspits, more often out the window. Civic laws tried to regulate the chaos. In 14th century Paris, it was illegal to throw waste onto the street without first shouting a warning, "Garde à l'eau! Watch out for the water!" It was a courtesy call, not unlike a prayer, before the night's contents came raining down. Still, danger lurked beneath. Privies, primitive toilets dug into the ground, were common in city homes, but they were rarely maintained. As the pits filled, they emitted noxious gases. Methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, the deadly cocktail of decomposition. Entire houses collapsed when overloaded privies beneath them exploded. To deal with the growing waste crisis, medieval cities turned to one of their most reviled professions, the gong farmer. These men worked at night, in silence and stink, armed with shovels and buckets. Their job, to dig out the filth from cesspits, latrines, and privy vaults. Gong farmers were paid well, but shunned by society. They were required by law to live on the outskirts of towns and forbidden from entering public spaces during the day. Their collections, known as night soil, were dumped far outside the city walls, or sold to farmers as fertilizer, a primitive and underappreciated form of waste recycling. Still, outbreaks of disease were constant. The Black Death of the 14th century killed nearly half of Europe's population. Though carried by fleas on rats, the plague thrived in conditions of squalor. With excrement in the streets, corpses in the gutters, and no understanding of microbial life, the people turned to prayer, leeches, and fire. Some cities began tentative reforms. In 1372, London created an ordinance requiring homeowners to cover their cesspits. In Nuremberg, city officials hired full-time waste inspectors. In Bruges, the first public latrines appeared, though only for men. Women were left to navigate the labyrinth of buckets and bush. The concept of bathhouses also made a quiet return, inspired not by Europe's own past, but by contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades. By the 15th century, communal bathhouses appeared in German and Italian towns. Some had steam rooms, separate sections for men and women, and even soap made from animal fats, lye, and herbs. But these too were short-lived. The church grew suspicious. Naked bodies mingling in steamy rooms. Scandalous. Bathhouses were condemned as places of sin, often closed during outbreaks of syphilis and plague. And so Europe remained dirty. Toilets were for the few, chamber pots rained, castles stank, cities festered. And for most people, hygiene was a private matter, best kept out of sight, out of mind, until disease made it impossible to ignore. But beneath the filth, seeds were stirring. Monks continued to copy ancient Roman manuals. Physicians experimented with perfumes, fumigants, and early antiseptics. Civic leaders started enforcing sanitation laws. Slowly, a new awareness began to take hold, one that would blossom in later centuries into the flush of modern hygiene. But for the average person in medieval Europe, the toilet was not a porcelain throne. It was a hole in a board. A bucket under the bed, a chute off a castle wall, and the smell? The smell was everywhere. It didn't begin with fanfare, no parade, no trumpet. No king waving from a balcony as the first modern toilet was born. And yet, what emerged in the shadowed corners of European manners, among tinkerers and thinkers, would change human life as profoundly as the wheel or the light bulb. The flush toilet. But to understand its rise, we must step back into the clamor and disease-ridden alleys of 17th century England. Cities had grown too large, too fast. London, in particular, was drowning in itself. By 1650, hundreds of thousands lived in tight quarters with no centralized sewage. Human waste collected in cesspools, open drains, and chamber pots. Night soil men carried it away by cart under moonlight, their carts groaning beneath humanity's burden. The air was fetid. The Thames, once a river of poets and ferrymen, had become a flow of feces and rotting refuse. And then, from among the damp manuscripts and chemical fumes, came a knight. Sir John Harington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, was not known for discretion. In 1596, he built a contraption for his manor, a seat with a cistern above it, and a pipe to carry away waste with a flush of water. He called it the Ajax, a pun on the Jakes. It worked, it was clever, the Queen even tried it. But England was not ready. The Ajax faded, mocked as eccentric. Still, the seed had been planted. The Industrial Revolution ignited new interest in urban sanitation. The population exploded. Cities became pressure cookers of filth. Outbreaks of cholera, previously unknown in Europe, began tearing through London, Manchester, Paris. The prevailing belief was miasma theory, that bad air caused disease. But in 1854, a doctor named John Snow traced a cholera outbreak to a single contaminated water pump in Soho. It wasn't the air, it was the water. Suddenly, the flush toilet wasn't a curiosity, it was urgent innovation. Inventors returned to Harrington's model. In 1775, Alexander Cummings patented a design that included an ace-shaped pipe, which trapped water and blocked smells from rising, a feature still present in every toilet today. Over the next century, names like Joseph Bramah, Thomas Twyford, and Thomas Crapper refined the mechanics. Yes, Crapper, a real man, a plumber and businessman who, while not inventing the toilet, did mass-produce and popularize sanitary plumbing fixtures in Victorian England. His name would live on in jest, but his impact was quite serious. By the late 19th century, porcelain toilets had become a symbol of modernity. They gleamed, they flushed. They promised health, privacy, and above all, dignity, but where did the waste go? The answer lay underground. London's Great Stink of 1858, when hot weather turned the Thames into a cesspool, forced Parliament to act. Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer, designed a network of sewers that redirected waste away from the city. His system, begun in 1859, used gravity, brick tunnels, and pumping stations to flush human refuse far downriver. It became a model for the world. Paris followed. So did Berlin, New York, Boston. Sewer systems, once the dream of ancient Rome, were reborn with iron and steam. And with sewers came plumbing codes, water treatment, wastewater science. Hygiene became a discipline, a civic duty, a political agenda. It entered schools, factories, tenements. In Japan, the revolution took a distinct shape. By the late 20th century, the Japanese toilet had surpassed its Western counterparts in innovation. Heated seats, bidet sprays, sound-masking music, deodorizing fans. The toilet was no longer just sanitary, it was technological art. In contrast, vast parts of the world remained without sanitation. Even in the 21st century, over 2 billion people still lacked access to safe toilets. Open defecation, waterborne illness, and environmental degradation continued reminding us that progress is uneven. Yet, in a strange way, toilets became mirrors. Not just physical mirrors mounted on bathroom walls, but social ones. They reflected class, culture, engineering, priorities. In castles, toilets had been perched on walls. In palaces, they were thrones. In villages, they were fields, forests, holes in the earth. The design of a toilet said everything. Was it made of wood or porcelain? Did it flush, compost, or flow? Was it private or communal? Did it require water, electricity, ritual? Did it exist at all? Anthropologists began studying toilets as cultural artifacts. In some cultures, toilets faced away from sacred directions. In others, they were integrated into ritual baths. In some countries, toilet paper was unknown. In others, it was seen as unhygienic, the great irony. As modernity advanced, humans spent billions to purify their waste, yet rarely spoke of it. The thing we all did daily, hidden behind closed doors, denied in polite conversation, ignored in education. And yet, from Harappa's brick drains, to Roman aqueducts, to the silent mechanism under a Japanese bidet, the story of toilets has always been the story of civilization itself. Because to manage waste is to confront what it means to be human. We are creatures of thought and culture, but also of digestion and decay. The toilet is where the sublime meets the mundane, a throne of clay, water, and pipe, an unspoken triumph. In the end, we can trace our progress not only by what we build upward, but by how we handle what we flush downward. And so the journey ends not in a royal court or battlefield, but in a small tiled room behind a closed door. Beneath a white seat, with a gentle sound of running water and a leva, a simple invention that saved millions and kept history flowing forward.